Imagine you're sitting at a dinner party surrounded by familiar faces. The atmosphere feels light. There's laughter, the gentle clinking of silverware, and an almost comfortable sense of belonging. Then suddenly something cuts through the air. A phrase uttered with irony, a subtle yet sharp comment. Everyone laughs, but something about the way that laughter echoes makes you realize it wasn't a joke, it was an attack disguised as humor. And for a moment, the whole world seems to be watching you, waiting to see how you'll react. This is the kind of moment that reveals how much human nature still carries shadows we pretend not to see. And that's precisely where the test begins. The test that Carl Jung would call the encounter with the shadow. Jung believed that everything that bothers us in others is, in fact, a projection of what we still don't understand in ourselves. When someone provokes you, they are not just trying to hurt you. They are unknowingly enacting a repressed part of their own soul. The attack, however personal it may seem, is almost always a reflection of the pain the other person is trying to hide. And paradoxically, when you feel the blow, what hurts is not what was said, but what inside you still believes that it could be true. But what to do when the attack comes from someone close? A colleague who hides behind humor, a friend who throws barbs between laughs, a relative who uses the word joke as a shield for cruelty. You try to laugh along, but the laughter comes out awkward. You pretend not to care, but something closes up inside, and then, later, in silence, the scene returns. You relive the moment with surgical detail, the intonation of the voice, the look in others' eyes, the awkward silence. And in your mind you create the perfect response, the one that didn't come at the time, but now seems brilliant. But the moment has already passed, and what remains is a bitter feeling of powerlessness. Jung would say that this cycle, that of being hurt, remaining silent and then ruminating, is the psyche's call for attention. At that moment, the soul is trying to show you something about yourself that the external world merely mirrors. Discomfort is not the enemy, it is the messenger. The problem is that we have been taught to fear discomfort, to run away from anything that disturbs us, to disguise pain with humor, or to mask it with anger. And so we continue to react in the same way, believing that we are defending ourselves when, in reality, we are betraying ourselves. There's a strange irony in this. The more we try to prove we're strong, the more we reveal our weaknesses. Jung observed that the ego, that mask we wear to survive, lives in a constant state of defense. It needs to feel right, admired, validated. But a single comment is enough to shake that entire structure. It's the moment the ego realizes it's not invincible. And that's exactly when the unconscious begins to work, bringing to the surface the parts of ourselves we prefer to hide. Perhaps the provocation isn't the problem. Perhaps it's the gateway, because insults only have power over those who still need validation. If you've already acknowledged your own shadow, if you've already forgiven yourself for being human, the poison loses its effect. But this requires courage, the courage to look inward and admit, yes, this affected me. Not to surrender to the pain, but to understand what it reveals. Think about how many times you've felt belittled by someone. How many times have you heard a comment that made you shrink, even if you pretended to be fine on the outside? The subsequent silence, the discomfort, the mental replay, all of this is your psyche trying to tell you something. Every word that hurts you is an arrow pointing to a part of you that still needs to be freed. And it is at this point that Jung becomes more relevant than ever. He saw life as a series of encounters with the unconscious. Each person, each situation, each confrontation is a mirror that reveals a fragment of yourself. When someone provokes you, the universe is asking you, what still controls you? Because true power lies not in responding, nor in winning the argument. It lies in not being dragged into the same emotional game. But that's easy to say and hard to do. Your heart races, your throat dries up, and the words seem to scream to get out. You feel the urge to justify yourself, to show that you're not wrong, to retaliate. This impulse is the ego crying out for survival. And it is at that exact moment that the game begins. The game of control. The provocateur often isn't even aware of what they're doing. They act driven by their own shadows, seeking in the other person a reflection of something they don't want to face. But the result is the same. They pull you into an emotional field where balance is lost. And if you enter that field, you've already lost. Because the simple act of reacting gives them control. So what to do? Remain silent? Pretend nothing happened? Retaliate? None of these answers are complete because they all stem from the same root, fear. The fear of appearing weak, of being judged, of losing the image the world has of you. But, as Jung said, there is no awakening of consciousness without pain. Pain is the price of freedom, and freedom is the beginning of individuation, the process of becoming who you are, beyond the masks, beyond the ego. When someone attacks you, your subconscious is inviting you to observe, not to react. It's as if the universe is saying, see what this awakens in you. The insult is the trigger, but the explosion is yours. And this perception changes everything, because when you begin to see the other not as an enemy, but as an instrument of your own self-knowledge, the power is reversed. The offender ceases to be the center of attention, and the center becomes you. Not the social you, but the essential you, the silent observer behind the emotions. But be warned, this awareness doesn't make you immune to pain. It only changes its nature. You will still feel the impact, but it won't overwhelm you. It's like watching a storm from a window, knowing it won't last forever. The difference is that now you observe the thunder, but you no longer run for cover. How many times have you wished you could go back in time and say what you didn't say? How many nights have you replayed entire dialogues in your head, imagining you could change something? What if in reality this desire to retaliate isn't about the other person, but about yourself? What if what you really want is to prove to yourself that you're not weak, that you know how to defend yourself, that you deserve respect? Jung would call this the ego's cry for lost integrity. The wounded ego wants to be seen, wants to be heard, but the soul doesn't want to prove anything. It wants to understand. Perhaps true power lies not in having the perfect answer, but in not needing to have one, in allowing silence to speak, in recognizing that the other person's attack says more about them than about you, and, above all, in realizing that your reaction is the truest reflection of your own evolution. The question then is not, why did they do this to me, but why does this still affect me? That is the difference between living as a victim and living as an observer, and it is this shift that marks the beginning of the inner journey, the first step toward what Jung called the self, the deep center where balance resides. When you understand this, something begins to dissolve. The need to prove yourself, the fear of appearing weak, the pride of being right, all of that loses its power. And what emerges in its place is something rare, serenity. Not the serenity of someone who has withdrawn from the world, but the serenity of someone who has understood it. And that's precisely where the first paradox of this journey lies. True strength doesn't lie in resisting the attack, but in embracing the lessons it brings. Because deep down, every word that tries to diminish you is just a silent invitation for you to wake up. Book for the next part. But how do you transform emotional chaos into inner serenity? How can we transform anger into clarity, fear into strength, and pain into awareness? In the next part, we will delve into what Jung called the shadow alchemy, the process of transforming everything that hurts you into everything that sets you free. There is an almost imperceptible instant between provocation and response, a tiny interval, but one that holds all the power of transformation. It is in this space that what Carl Jung called the birth of consciousness resides. It is there, when you feel the impulse to react, to defend yourself, to attack back, that something deeper happens. The unconscious tries to take control, but the self, your most lucid essence, whispers that there is another choice. But almost no one listens to this voice. Most of us respond before understanding what is happening inside. We react like machines, repeating patterns, feeding the same cycle we promised to abandon. And yet, every time the world hurts us, it is only offering us the chance to free ourselves. Jung said that, what we do not confront in ourselves, we end up encountering in the world as our destiny. Think about how many times you've found yourself in the same situation, only with different people. The arrogant colleague changes face. The sarcastic friend has another name. The controlling relative takes on a different role, but the pattern repeats itself. This is not coincidence. It's psychology. Life insists until you understand the lesson. And the lesson in this case is learning to master yourself before trying to master any situation. Anger, hurt, resentment, all of this is trapped energy, condensed within you. When someone provokes you, this energy awakens and seeks an outlet. It's natural to feel the urge to retaliate because the ego believes that remaining silent is the same as surrendering, but it isn't. Retaliating is merely reacting on the same level. It's fighting within the other person's territory, under the rules they've defined. It's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. The ego wants to win, but the soul wants to understand. And that's the difference between continuing the cycle and transcending the game. Imagine this scene. You're in a meeting and you present an idea aloud. Someone, with a smirk, comments, "Ah, another one of your complicated theories." Everyone laughs. You feel your blood rush, your throat tighten, the urge to respond. But something inside makes you stop. You realize what's happening. It's not about the idea, it's about control. The other person wants to see if you lose your composure. And for the first time, you don't give them the gift they expect. You simply face them calmly, let the silence work, and continue. The room changes. The power shifts. And what once seemed like weakness is now mastery. Mastery over oneself. Calmness is a power the world still doesn't understand. We live in a culture that confuses peace with passivity, but there's a huge difference between being submissive and being serene. Serenity is a form of emotional intelligence. It's the ability to see beyond the moment, beyond the provocation. It's realizing that a comment doesn't define who you are. It only reveals who the other person hasn't yet managed to become. Jung believed that human beings carry within themselves both light and darkness. The shadow, as he called it, is everything we reject in ourselves. It is wounded pride, the fear of appearing weak, the desire for approval, hatred disguised as indifference. When someone attacks you, what hurts is the part of the shadow that has been touched. It is not the insult that causes pain, but the identification with it. If someone calls you a fool and it hurts you, it is because a part of you still fears being a fool. If they call you arrogant and you feel anger, it is because, on some level, you fear that this is true. When you know yourself, the insult loses its aim. But reaching that point is not easy. It is an internal, silent work that requires confronting one's own abysses. It is admitting that within each of us there is a tyrant and a victim, an aggressor and an innocent, a strength and a fragility, and that all coexist. Wisdom, Jung said, is born when we stop denying what we are and begin to integrate what has always been fragmented. The alchemy of the soul does not happen in the temple of calm, but in the laboratory of chaos. Take Clara, for example. She always saw herself as a peaceful person, incapable of arguing. She avoided conflict at all costs. She thought that being polite and understanding was the same as being evolved. Until one day, at work, her boss humiliated her in front of the team. She felt her heart race, but said nothing. He smiled, swallowed hard, and went on with his day. But in the following weeks, something began to change. She started dreaming of situations where she screamed, broke things, and rebelled. Her unconscious was screaming for expression. Jung would say that the shadow, when repressed, always finds a way to emerge. And when she finally exploded, it wasn't at work. It was at home, in a fight with her husband, over a trivial matter. The anger she thought she didn't have was just waiting for the moment to come out. It was only when Clara realized this that the true transformation process began. She understood that she didn't need to repress her anger, but to understand it. That she could listen to what the emotion was saying without being dominated by it. And little by little, she learned to set boundaries without guilt, to say no without fear, to stand up for herself without losing her composure. This is the alchemy of the shadow in action, transforming poison into medicine, anger into awareness, fear into strength. Life will continue to test you. The provocations won't disappear. They'll just change form. But the more aware you are, the less impact they'll have. The goal isn't to eliminate conflict, but to change how you perceive it. When you understand that the other person is simply reacting to their own pain, something changes within you. You begin to feel compassion instead of anger, not because you're superior, but because you understand the mechanism. The person attacking you is fighting against themselves. You were just in the way. There's an old story Jung liked to cite. A Tibetan monk was captured during an invasion and spent years in captivity, being humiliated and beaten. When he was finally freed, someone asked him if he had felt fear. He replied, "Yes, I was afraid of losing compassion for my captors." That is the essence of unwavering serenity, the awareness that the hatred of another need not become your own. When you don't react, the other person reveals themselves. They expected resistance. They expected a duel, but they found a mirror. And the mirror is the most powerful instrument of self-knowledge. It reflects back what the other person projects, without absorbing anything. This is what Jung called the transcendent function, the point of equilibrium between instinct and consciousness. When you reach this state, the attack loses its meaning. You no longer need to prove anything because you have already understood that no one can unsettle you without your permission. But make no mistake, this is not weakness. It is silent strength. It is inner mastery. It is the opposite of apathy, because true self-control is not born from the absence of emotion, but from the ability to feel it and not be swallowed by it. It's like watching a fire without touching it. You feel the heat. You recognize the danger, but you choose not to get burned. Calmness is not a gift. It's a construct. It requires practice, patience, and self-knowledge. It means looking inward with brutal honesty and admitting, yes, I still let myself be affected. I still want to be accepted. I still fear being rejected. And, by recognizing this, you begin to dissolve the power the world has over you. Because what the world truly affects are the parts of you that you haven't yet learned to embrace. When Jung spoke of individuation, he wasn't referring to a mystical state of perfection, but to the capacity for wholeness, to integrate light and shadow, consciousness and instinct, mind and heart. To be whole is to accept that good and evil coexist within you, and that balance doesn't come from negation, but from harmony between opposites. When you understand this, provocation loses its venom, offense loses its weight, disrespect loses its power, and this is where the real journey begins. Because calmness is not the destination, it's the path. Every time you choose not to react, you strengthen the bridge between the ego and the self. Every time you observe instead of attacking, consciousness expands. And every time you understand the other instead of hating them, the unconscious is illuminated. Revenge imprisons you. Understanding liberates you. Anger poisons you. Clarity purifies you. Punishing others keeps you trapped in the past. Learning from it leads to evolution. The world will not stop testing you, but if you master your mind, there will be no more testing, only learning. And perhaps that is the central point of Jung's message. No one hurts you without your unconscious consent. What affects you only does so because it touches a part of you that has not yet been understood, and what is understood loses the power to hurt. The game changes when you understand this. Control ceases to be an external struggle and becomes an internal exercise. And the enemy is no longer in front of you. It dissolves because it was never the other. It was always fear, insecurity, the ego, and when the ego is silenced, the self awakens. It is in this awakening that true freedom is born. The freedom not to react, not to prove, not to fight. The freedom to simply be. But what happens when the other person realizes you're not fazed? What happens when the provocateur sees their game has lost its effect? That's when the game changes direction. And that's what we'll talk about in the next part. Because understanding the mechanism is one thing, but learning to act gracefully in the face of it is the next stage of awareness. There's a type of war that happens every day, but almost no one notices. There are no weapons, no uniforms, no blood. It's a subtle war, fought in glances, in words, in silences laden with intention. It happens in company corridors, at dinner tables, in conversations that begin with laughter and end with embarrassment. Jung would call this the theater of the ego, the stage where human roles are played not to reveal the truth but to hide it. It all starts with something small, a snide comment, a joke that doesn't sound like a joke. The provocateur observes your reaction with the same gaze as someone throwing a stone into a lake to see how high the waves reach. He wants to gauge its depth, and when you react, he wins. Because the goal was never the content of the offense, it was the control of your emotional state. Disrespect is merely the bait, your reaction is the prize. But why does this happen? Why does someone find pleasure in provoking another? Jung said that human beings project outwards everything they don't accept within themselves. When someone attacks you, what they are really trying to destroy is something that bothers them inside. The arrogance they see in you is often the arrogance they try to deny in themselves. The contempt they show is a reflection of their own insecurity. Thus, each provocation is a disguised mirror of confrontation. Have you ever wondered how many times you've entered this game without realizing it? How many times has a simple phrase made your body react as if it were being physically threatened? Your heart races, your face flushes, and your mind fires off automatic justifications. You feel compelled to explain yourself, to prove your worth, to restore your image. But what you're really trying to restore is the feeling of control over how others perceive you. It's the ego, not the self, that speaks. Jung asserted that the ego is an actor on the grand stage of the psyche. It doesn't want to be forgotten, nor contradicted. It lives for the approval of the audience. And when someone challenges it, it panics because it feels its identity is at stake. Therefore, when someone provokes it, the ego reacts like a child whose toy has been snatched from its hands. It doesn't want to understand. It wants to retaliate. It doesn't seek wisdom. It seeks revenge. But what would happen if, for a moment, you decided not to react? Not in the sense of suppressing, but of observing. If, instead of responding to the provocation, you simply perceived what it awakens within you. What would be the dominant emotion? Anger, shame, fear, pride? This simple act of observing is the beginning of the dissolution of the game, because what the provocateur wants is engagement, and observation is the silent refusal to play. Consider a common example. A group of friends in a circle chatting. Everyone's laughing until one of them cracks a joke about you, something about your appearance, your mannerisms, or your past. The circle erupts in laughter. For a moment, you feel the urge to respond in kind, but you notice something. His tone isn't lighthearted. There's a hint of bitterness behind it. So instead of reacting, you look at him and simply smile. A calm smile, not of irony, but of understanding. And the conversation continues. The collective laughter begins to fade, as if it's lost its meaning. You didn't fuel the game, and the game ended there. But that doesn't mean the provocateur leaves satisfied. On the contrary, he feels threatened, because what bothers an uncontrolled mind most is finding someone it can't unbalance. The provocateur thrives on the emotional chaos of others. When you remain calm, he finds himself facing his own emptiness, and that terrifies him. Have you ever noticed how some people seem to feed off the discomfort of others? They create ambiguous situations, utter venomous phrases, and then say, "It was just a joke." This behavior has a deep origin, the need to validate one's own worth at the expense of others. It's a primitive mechanism of the unconscious. Jung would call this a manifestation of the wounded persona, the mask the individual created to be accepted, but which begins to crumble. When this mask cracks, the person tries to assert themselves by diminishing the other. But the most dangerous thing isn't the provocateur, it's what happens inside you when he speaks. Because the real battle isn't with him, it's with your own shadow. The part of you that feels the need to prove something. The part that can't stand being seen as weak. The part that still wants approval. And as long as that part continues to react, you will remain vulnerable. Now, stop and think. How many times have you been the instigator? How many times have you attacked someone just to relieve your own tension, to feel in control, to hide an insecurity? The theater of the ego is not performed by just one side. Everyone, at some point, has been both actor and audience member at the same time. Jung would say that this is the blind spot of consciousness, the inability to recognize one's own shadow while it is acting. The curious thing is that disrespect in its essence is a test, not just of your patience, but of your conscience. It asks, do you still need to react to prove who you are? And every time you fall for the provocation, the answer is yes. With each attack that throws you off balance, you confirm that you are still controlled by the same internal forces you think you control. That's why Jung believed that true growth doesn't come from conquering others, but from integrating the parts of yourself that are still fighting amongst themselves. There's a story about a monk who was once insulted by a visitor. The man shouted, provoked him, tried to make him lose his temper. The monk just looked at him silent. After minutes of insults, the visitor gave up and left. A disciple asked, "Master, how did you manage to remain so calm?" And he replied, "When someone offers you a gift and you don't accept it, to whom does the gift belong?" The disciple understood. An insult only becomes a wound when you receive it. But this is a wisdom that requires practice, because the modern world encourages the opposite: immediate reaction, the pleasure of responding, the eagerness to have the last word. Social media is the clearest mirror of this theater. Every comment is a trigger. Every disagreement becomes a battlefield. And, without realizing it, millions of people spend the entire day reacting, fighting, justifying themselves, freely surrendering control of their emotions to strangers. Society lives in a collective state of constant provocation. The ego loves conflict because it makes it feel alive. But the self, the center of consciousness described by Jung, doesn't need that. It is serene, observant, whole. When you begin to connect with this center, the provocations continue to exist, but they no longer find a surface on which to cling. They pass through you like wind sweeping through a mountain. But here's a question few people ask. What happens when you stop reacting? When, suddenly, the game loses its appeal for those who have always played? The answer is surprising. Some will try to provoke you even more. Because there are people who can't stand the peace of others. It exposes the chaos they hide. Others, however, disarm themselves, because their silence reflects what they fear to face. Their composure becomes a dangerous mirror, and sometimes a single calm reaction is enough for the provocateur to realize that there is no longer fertile ground for disrespect. This doesn't mean you should endure everything in silence. It means you need to understand the game before choosing how to play it. There are times when silence is power. There are others when boundaries are necessary. What changes is the starting point. Acting consciously, not impulsively. The ego reacts. The self responds. The provocation then ceases to be an attack and transforms into a psychological experiment. You begin to observe the other as one observes a phenomenon. Each of their words is a symptom. Each gesture, a clue. And suddenly, what was once offensive becomes intriguing. You begin to see the suffering hidden behind the aggression, and compassion, which previously seemed like weakness, reveals itself as the purest form of strength. The world isn't made up of enemies trying to hurt you. It's made up of people trying to survive their own pain. When you understand that, anger dissolves, because whoever sees the pain behind the attack no longer has a reason to respond with more pain. But this awareness comes at a price, the isolation of the warrior who no longer finds adversaries. Because when you understand the game, you realize it was always an illusion, that there was never a real fight, only echoes of insecurities clashing in the void. And it is in this void that true freedom is born. When insult becomes mere sound, when the gaze of another no longer defines your worth, when silence ceases to be weakness and transforms into power, that is when the game ends. But there is one last secret, one that Jung hinted at but rarely explained. Power lies not only in understanding the game, but in learning to dance within it without losing one's center. And it is about this art, the art of the elegant response, the invisible defense that transforms attack into embarrassment, that we will begin to delve into in the next part. There are moments in life when silence is more powerful than any response. The modern world, however, teaches us the opposite, that we must react, defend ourselves, make it clear who we are, show that no one can diminish us. Digital culture has amplified this. We are conditioned to respond quickly, to prove our worth in seconds, to not let the last word come from someone else. But Carl Jung said that what we resist persists. The more we react, the more we feed the game that consumes us. And that is why the elegance of the response, or in certain cases the absence of it, is one of the highest stages of consciousness. Serenity in the face of provocation is not inertia. It's a psychological strategy. It's mastering one's own energy instead of surrendering it. Studies from Stanford University have shown that the human brain takes an average of only 0.2 seconds to react to an emotional stimulus, but takes almost 6 seconds to consciously process it. This small interval is the difference between instinct and wisdom. Those who can inhabit this space between impulse and action begin to shape their own reality. It is in this interval that the power of what Jung called the transcendent function is born, the bridge between emotion and consciousness. There is a little-known story about Jung that illustrates this. Once, during a conference in Zurich, a student abruptly interrupted him, questioning his credibility and saying that his theories about the unconscious were absurd. The audience expected Jung to confront him with authority, but he simply smiled, took a sip of water, and replied, "Maybe so. Perhaps all of this is indeed absurd, but even absurdities have something to say about human nature." The auditorium fell silent. The student was left speechless. Jung didn't win the debate, he dissolved it. The attack lost its meaning because he didn't defend himself. He merely showed that the other was struggling with something within himself. When someone tries to hurt you, there's always a hidden objective, to provoke an emotional reaction. It's called a control test. The person wants to see if they can penetrate your core, throw you off balance. And that's where the first invisible weapon of elegance comes in, a cold smile. It's not sarcasm nor irony. It's a gesture of awareness. It's the silent acknowledgement that you saw the game, but chose not to participate. It's the look that says, I understand what you're trying to do, and it doesn't have to work. The power of this gesture lies precisely in the fact that it doesn't fuel the conflict. The tension dissolves because the attacker loses their fulcrum, your reaction. In 2019, a Harvard Business School study analyzed conflict dynamics in corporate meetings. It found that when one person reacts aggressively to provocation, the cortisol level of the entire group increases by up to 40%. But when someone responds calmly and lightly, the atmosphere regulates itself in seconds. Serenity is contagious, just like chaos. Self-control, therefore, is not just a personal virtue, it's a social force. It changes the atmosphere around you, even silently. But how do you develop this kind of control in a world that thrives on triggers? It's simple in theory, but rare in practice, because the wounded ego wants revenge. It wants to show that it's not weak, that it knows how to respond, that it doesn't accept disrespect. But the most elegant response is the one that doesn't need to be heard. When you respond calmly, with a neutral phrase, with a serene gesture, you level up in the game. It's no longer the character being attacked, it's the author observing from the outside. A real-life example. Imagine a woman named Laura. She works at a company where the environment is competitive, and a colleague constantly provokes her with subtle comments, praising her ironically, insinuating that she is favored because she is too friendly. One day, in the middle of a meeting, he says in front of everyone, "You must have good connections, Laura. You always know what to say at the right time." The group laughs. Inside, she feels the urge to respond, but she breathes. She smiles and says calmly, "Yes, maybe I do. In fact, I have excellent connections with common sense." The room falls silent. She didn't shout, she didn't attack. She simply returned the mirror with elegance. Jung would say that, at that moment, she wasn't the ego reacting to the shadow of the other, but the consciousness observing the human theater. But it's not always necessary to respond. Sometimes the true response is simply to go with the flow, to continue talking about the previous subject, as if nothing had been said. This attitude, which Jung called conscious integration, communicates a powerful message. The disrespect is so small that it doesn't even deserve recognition. When you ignore with presence, it's not passivity, it's dominance. It's saying, without words, you don't have access to my center. There's a curious detail about human behavior. The brain is incapable of sustaining a one-sided conflict for very long. When one party doesn't react, the aggressor's tension begins to turn against them. They need resistance to stay standing. Without it, they become disorganized. That's why serenity disarms. The absence of reaction forces the other to deal with their own discomfort. It's the psychological application of the principle of emotional jujitsu, using the opponent's strength against them without needing to attack. And what if the disrespect persists? In that case, the second invisible weapon comes into play, the discrete boundary. The difference between elegance and submission lies in the boundary. Saying no is a form of respect, both for oneself and for the other person. But the elegant no doesn't come with anger, it comes with clarity. It's a simple phrase, said in a firm and neutral voice. Something like, "I know you didn't mean to offend me, but I don't like that kind of comment." Nothing more. No justifications, no drama. This is what Jung would call integrated consciousness. Firmness without rigidity, clarity without aggression. Studies in social psychology confirm its effectiveness. An experiment published in Personality and Social Psychology Review. The study showed that people who express boundaries calmly and directly are perceived as more secure and respected, while those who react with anger are seen as emotionally fragile. It's paradoxical. The more control you demonstrate, the more respect the other person feels, even unconsciously. However, there is a risk in pushing boundaries, the fear of rejection. Many avoid taking a stand because they fear breaking the mood, appearing cold, losing approval. But this fear is a trap of the ego, the same one that keeps you trapped in the need to please. Jung said that no tree can grow to the sky without its roots touching hell. In other words, you cannot be authentic without facing the discomfort of displeasing others. Authenticity has a price, but the price of submission is much higher. Now imagine another scenario. A man named Raphael, married for years, lives in a relationship where his partner constantly belittles him in public. He doesn't respond, but suffers in silence. He believes that silence is noble. But one day, during a dinner with friends, She makes yet another joke about him, this time about his income. The group laughs. He takes a deep breath and in a calm voice says, "I know you like to joke, but when it's about me in public, I don't find it funny. Let's leave this kind of thing for another time." The atmosphere falls silent. She looks at him surprised. For the first time, he set a boundary without aggression. From then on, something changes. He didn't react. He asserted himself. Serenity, used with clarity, is the most mature form of strength. But what if, even with the limit set, the other person insists? What if the environment remains toxic? What if respect doesn't come? At this point, the third invisible weapon emerges: strategic withdrawal. Leaving a situation that harms your peace is not giving up. It's wisdom. Jung said that no one can enter a river and come out dry. If you remain in environments where disrespect is constant, you will inevitably absorb some of it. Leaving, therefore, is a form of purification. This withdrawal can be silent or symbolic. Sometimes, simply ending a conversation with an "excuse me" is enough. Other times, it's a greater distancing from a group, a job, a relationship. The central point is the same: choosing peace instead of the spotlight. And the most curious thing is that this attitude, in the long run, changes how people perceive you. You stop being seen as someone reactive and start being seen as someone selective. Respect is born not from force, but from consistency. Neuroscientists call this reverse mirror effect. When a person remains calm in the face of aggression, the aggressor's brain enters a state of cognitive dissonance. They expected resistance and don't know how to react to its absence. The energy turns against them. It's as if in the other person's silence they are forced to hear their own noise. And this is a profoundly uncomfortable experience for someone who lives in a state of control. All of this seems simple, but it requires a special kind of courage. The courage not to lose oneself. The world teaches that being strong means reacting, but Jung taught that being strong means observing. True power is not dominating others, but dominating one's own impulse to dominate them. It is remaining whole when everyone around is fragmented. It is not allowing the anger of others to awaken your own. And if you want to test this, try it for a day. Choose a moment when you would normally react and instead breathe. Just observe. See what happens to the other person. See what happens inside you. There's a chance something will be revealed. Perhaps an old anger, a fear, a memory. This is the raw material of consciousness. Jung said that transformation doesn't happen when we resist the unconscious, but when we dialogue with it. Every provocation is a chance for internal dialogue. Over time, you'll realize something surprising. The respect you sought outside begins to blossom within. The opinions of others matter less. The gaze of others ceases to define who you are. And the irony is that when you no longer need to be respected to feel worthy, respect comes naturally. It's a paradox. The less you demand it, the more it appears. Ultimately, elegance in the face of conflict is an art that unites psychology and spirituality, reason and instinct, shadow and light. It stems from the understanding that no one can touch you if you don't open the door. And, contrary to appearances, it doesn't make you distant from people. It makes you magnetic, because serene presence is rare, and everything that is rare attracts. In an era where everyone shouts, those who speak calmly dominate the sound. In a world where everyone reacts, those who observe have the power. The elegant response is not a social technique, it's a state of awareness. It's the recognition that control is not in the hands of the attacker, but in the hands of those who choose not to be dragged along. And when you understand this, you realize that true victory was never about silencing the other. It was about silencing the chaos within yourself. The journey continues, because mastering behavior is only the beginning. The next step is more profound, learning to transform attack into a mirror, offense into revelation, conflict into learning. And it is about this last stage, final immunity, the moment when insult loses its power to exist, that we will talk about next. There comes a moment when silence ceases to be a strategy and becomes a form of freedom. It's when you finally understand that you no longer need to win any arguments, justify any choices, or remain where respect has ceased to exist. Jung said that the human soul only matures when it learns to withdraw from places where energy stops circulating. Withdrawal, therefore, is not escape. It is awareness. It's when you understand that there are battles that don't need to be fought, because the simple fact of still being there is already a defeat. Many confuse leaving with giving up, but they are opposite movements. Giving up is abandoning something out of weakness. Leaving is refusing to waste strength where it is not welcome. The world tries to convince you that staying is a sign of courage, that enduring everything is noble, that persisting is a virtue. But in reality, maturity is the ability to recognize the point at which presence becomes self-sabotage. The ego wants to continue. It wants to prove, convince, win. But the self, the deep core of consciousness that Jung spoke of, simply observes and says, "This is no longer necessary." There's a quiet wisdom in simply getting up and leaving, not theatrically, not as if trying to draw attention, but as someone who respects their own inner space. Imagine a dinner where the conversation gradually transforms into veiled ironies and jokes. You realize you're being tested again. You could respond, set boundaries, argue, but there's something different this time, a clarity that doesn't need noise. You finish your drink, thank them, and leave. The sound of the glass on the table is more eloquent than any response. Because your absence becomes a mirror, and the other person's discomfort begins to occupy the place of your former pain. Strategic withdrawal is one of the most underestimated gestures of emotional intelligence. Research in behavioral psychology shows that conscious distancing, when done without anger or resentment, reduces the body's physiological stress level by up to 70%. The mind regulates itself when it understands that it no longer needs to fight to be heard. The simple act of not remaining where the energy is hostile is already a cure. Jung said that what is resisted persists. What is accepted transforms. Accepting that certain relationships, environments, or situations are no longer compatible with your frequency is an act of self-love, not indifference. But it's not always easy to recognize when it's time to leave. Sometimes the emotional connection is so strong that attachment disguises itself as hope. You believe you can still change the other person, that one more conversation will solve everything, that one day they will understand. And, in this process, you wear yourself out trying to heal wounds that aren't yours. Jung would call this projection the unconscious desire to save in the other what you haven't yet healed in yourself. While you insist on transforming the one who hurts you, you are actually asking yourself for the courage to transform yourself. There's a story about a patient of Jung's who experienced exactly this. She was an intelligent, sensitive woman, but she was trapped in a marriage where she was constantly belittled. Despite the humiliations, she said, "He was only like that because he had a wounded heart." Jung replied, "And who takes care of your wounded heart?" That question was the turning point. Shortly afterward, she left, not amidst screams, but in silence. Later, upon meeting Jung again, she said, "It was the first silence that healed me." It's curious how silence can become the most powerful sound when it arises from understanding. When you withdraw from an environment, the world interprets it as a loss, but the unconscious knows it's liberation. Leaving a place, a friendship, or a relationship is also leaving behind a version of yourself that accepted less than it deserved. It's a rebirth disguised as a farewell. The ego laments, but the soul breathes. Have you ever noticed that the most serene people you know aren't those who never get angry, but those who know when to leave? They don't yell, they don't dramatize, they don't try to convince anyone of anything. They just leave. And the instant they leave, something within them expands. The energy that was previously spent trying to protect themselves transforms into clarity. The mind reorganizes itself. The body is relieved. There's a kind of peace that only arises after the final attempt. But there's also a paradox. The act of leaving isn't the end of everything. It's the beginning of something bigger. Because by leaving one space, you discover another. The emptiness that once seemed frightening becomes fertile. It's there that creativity returns, that emotions stabilize, that the self finds space to express itself without noise. Jung said that no one can see their own reflection in running water, only in still water. By leaving the environments that cloud you, you begin to see yourself again. The hardest part, however, isn't physically leaving. It's letting go emotionally. It's stopping revisiting the past in search of justice, stopping replaying dialogues in your mind, stopping imagining what you should have said. The human brain has a natural tendency to seek emotional closure, a phenomenon studied by neuropsychology as the Zeigarnik effect. It causes unfinished thoughts to remain active until they are resolved. That's why, after leaving, the mind tries to return, as if it needed the last chapter. But true resolution doesn't come from the outside. It comes when you understand that there's nothing more to be explained, that what needed to be learned has already been learned. Sometimes it's necessary to distance yourself even from yourself, from old beliefs, automatic reactions, the constant desire to be understood. Jung stated that individuation, the process of becoming whole, requires solitude, not physical isolation, but an inner pause. It is in this recollection that you realize that life has never been about convincing the world, but about reconciling with it. Imagine a person who spent years trying to please others. At work, they never said no. In relationships, they always gave in. They thought being loved was the same as being useful. One day, exhausted, they decide to stop. For the first time, they say, "I can't," and they discover that the world doesn't crumble. On the contrary, respect begins to emerge. That's the essence of withdrawal. It reorganizes the field. When you put yourself back on your axis, the universe repositions you. Many people stay in toxic environments because they believe that leaving is a moral failure. But the truth is that there are times when staying is the real failure, the failure to choose yourself. When you understand this, the guilt disappears. You realize you don't owe explanations for wanting peace. That peace is not a prize. It's a right. And more than that, it's a state that can only be achieved when you refuse the noise. Modern psychology confirms what Jung intuited decades ago. Withdrawal is a sign of mental health. Research from the London Institute of Neuroscience shows that distancing oneself from environments of continuous conflict can reduce symptoms of anxiety and insomnia by up to 60%. The human body is a mirror of the psyche. It becomes ill when the soul remains where it does not want to be. When you decide to go, something inside you aligns. It's as if the whole world respects your choice. Opportunities that once seemed distant begin to appear. The right people come closer, and a feeling of lightness replaces the weight of insistence. The unconscious works in silence. It rewards coherent movement. And there's another detail. When you withdraw gracefully, without resentment, the impact is greater than any direct response. The other person notices, even if they don't admit it. Absence begins to speak, and the echo of your silence makes more noise than words ever could. Jung said that the unconscious of others senses our silence before their minds understand it. That's why, when you leave serenely, the world notices. Leaving, then, is not the end. It's the point where you stop being a character in someone else's story and become the author of your own again. It's the moment when you understand that you no longer need to be accepted, only to be true to yourself. Strategic withdrawal is, in fact, the victory of discernment over instinct. And once you learn to leave without resentment, the game changes forever. Because whoever knows when it's time to go is never again a hostage to anything, not to people, not to places, not to memories. But there is something even deeper ahead, something that transcends even the act of leaving. It is the point where the insult ceases to exist, where the other no longer has power, and the very concept of offense loses its meaning. It is the state that Jung would call psychic immunity, when the human being ceases to be affected not because they shut down, but because they understand. And it is in this final understanding that the journey reaches its highest point, where pain transforms into wisdom and silence becomes presence. There comes a point in the journey when the world no longer holds the same weight. Words that once hurt now sound like distant echoes, and the gaze of others no longer defines the reflection you see in the mirror. It's the moment when you realize that everything you were looking for, respect, recognition, balance, was always in one place, inside you. Carl Jung said, "He who looks outside dreams. He who looks inside awakens." And that's exactly it. Awakening isn't an explosion of light, but a silence that suddenly makes sense. Getting this far isn't about becoming invincible, but about ceasing to react as if you need to defend yourself from the world. True immunity isn't coldness, it's lucidity. It's understanding that the insult was never about you, but about the person who said it. That the other person's anger is merely a confession of their own chaos, and that every time someone tries to diminish it, they are actually begging for someone to see it. From that point on, you don't react. You understand. And understanding is the most revolutionary gesture a human being can make. But understanding isn't enough. You need to apply it. Wisdom only becomes real when it transforms into behavior, when it's incorporated into your routine, your conversations, your choices. Therefore, before this video ends, I want to propose a simple plan, a map of inner practice, so that everything you've heard isn't lost amidst the distractions of the day. A plan that helps you transform knowledge into presence. First, observe, don't react. For the next 7 days, practice mindful silence. Choose a moment when you would normally react to criticism, irony, a provocative look, and simply breathe. Count to 3 before responding. Notice what happens inside you, the heat, the impulse, the pride. Just observe. This pause is the first step to freedom. The ego wants to speak, but the self wants to understand. Give voice to what is deep, not to what is immediate. Second, write what you feel, not what happened. Take a notebook and, at the end of each day, write down the situations that destabilized you. But instead of describing the event, describe the emotion. Write, I felt angry when someone interrupted me. I felt afraid of appearing weak. I felt ashamed when I wasn't listened to. Naming the feeling is illuminating it. Jung stated that what remains unconscious governs life, and we call it destiny. Naming the emotion is the first act of liberation. Third, establish your boundaries calmly. Practice saying no without anger. I didn't like it without justification. I prefer it this way without fear. Do this once a day, even for small things. A calm and firm voice is more powerful than any shout. It communicates consistency. When you take a stand without getting worked up, the energy changes. The people around you begin to respect what they previously questioned. Room. Redefine your presence. Start consciously distancing yourself from environments that drain your energy. This doesn't mean abandoning people, but changing how you relate to them. If a space doesn't welcome you, reduce your time there. If a conversation repeats itself with the same dynamics, change direction. And if a social circle holds you back more than it nourishes you, make room for something new. Life rewards those who create